Greetings, everyone, and good evening. My name is Dr. Jacqueleen Bido, and I will bring forth the topic of structural racism, the catalyst of food deserts. One of the things that I will say prior to presenting is that this presentation is built from a lens in order to shift your thinking and open up your mind to the perspectives that exist from a lived experience. And it is imperative that you utilize your chat in parts of this presentation. And so I'm preparing you so that you are able to type in your chat and know that this is an inclusive setting. And please do not hesitate to write commentary, thoughts, feelings that you feel if it's uncomfortable, because what I'm about to present is going to take you on a journey. And and I thank all of the panelists before me and the presenters before me for such a eloquent conversation. Next slide. Reflection. Think of a time when you were hungry as a child and write in the chat some of the feelings you felt and behaviors you exhibited. Excellent. Thank you all for participating in that chat. I'm seeing a lot of answers that I have experienced myself. Thank you for Tobias for being transparent about the behaviors. Excellent. Next slide, please. In order to engage in the conversation about structural racism, I'm going to present two definitions that exist. The first I will read aloud. Structural racism refers to the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, and criminal justice. Next slide. The second definition. The term structural racism refers to a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. Please, in your chat, write 1 or 2 for the definition that you relate to the most or can relate to the most as it's defined. Excellent. My presentation is written from the lived experience of definition number 2. Next slide. When will our consciousness grow so tender that we will act to prevent human misery rather than avenge it? Eleanor Roosevelt. Next slide. Historical examples of structural racism. Next slide. 1787. It is impossible for us to speak about structural racism without bringing up the very Constitution that has established the United States of America. Slavery was implicitly recognized in the original Constitution in provisions such as Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, commonly known as the 3/5 Compromise, which provided that 3/5 of each state's enslaved populations, quote, other persons, was to be added to its free population for the purpose of apportioning seats in the United States House of Representatives, its number of electoral votes, and direct taxes among the states. Next slide. Slavery forever dead. Next slide. 1865, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. We just celebrated Juneteenth, and 1865 is why we celebrate Juneteenth in commemoration of the emancipation of the slave. I underlined, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Words have power, and as we proceed through this slide, we will understand why I underlined that portion of the 1865 amendment of the Constitution. Next slide. Never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead. Next slide. Historical food justice. Take a moment and reflect on that picture. Write in the commentary, what do you notice about this picture? In the chat, anything you may notice, you could just write in the chat. Next slide, please. 1969. It began January 1969 at an Episcopal church in Oakland, and within weeks it went from feeding a handful of kids to hundreds. The Black Panther Party's free breakfast program was established and supported by party members and volunteers that went to local grocery stores to solicit donations, consulted with the nutritionist on healthy breakfast options for children, and prepared and served the food free of charge. This is what is historically the model for free breakfast in academic settings. This was the model. Before 1969, before the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program, free breakfast for children did not exist. Next slide. Women, infants, and children. Next slide. 1974, Women, Infants, and Children's first site opened. It was established as a supplemental food program aimed at improving the health of pregnant mothers, infants, and children in response to growing concern over malnutrition among many poverty-stricken mothers and young children. Next slide. Structural racism, school to prison pipeline. Next slide. 1994, the label of zero tolerance began with the Gun-Free School Act of 1994, when Congress authorized public school funding subject to the adoption of a zero tolerance policy. This policy subsequently impacted children of color, and it was not because they were carrying guns. The school had the autonomy to interpret how they would implement zero tolerance, and it ended up being zero tolerance for behaviors that had nothing to do with weapons. And historically, students of color have been disproportionately suspended and expelled from institutions of learning at a rate that is egregious at best. Next slide. Structural racism, mass incarceration, 2008. In 2008, 37% of Black high school dropouts were incarcerated. 1 in 6 Latino men born today can expect to be incarcerated in their lifetime. More than 60% of the people in prison are people of color. And I take you back to the statement, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. This is where words matter. They have power in policy, because although slaves were emancipated by the writing of one policy, there was an enactment for mass incarceration in order to align with what was then transitioned from slavery to chain gangs, to a majority of African Americans and Latinos who were arrested and not processed in a judicial just system. So when we read the emancipation and we celebrate Juneteenth, we must always remember that words have power, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Next slide. Structural racism and the miseducation of equity. Next slide. Look at the following and answer the following question. Is this equitable? I see one answer, no. Thank you, Fallon. Anyone else? Is this equitable? Not sure. Great. Next. Not sure. Excellent. No. Wonderful. So the answer to this is we don't know. I don't know if those are male, females. I don't know what they identify as. I know that the number exists and everyone has 2 representatives. But what we don't know is, and this is the miseducation of equity, is that it does matter if a Latina is in the room. And I'm speaking for myself. It does matter if a Latina is in the room, but it matters more if the Latina's voice is heard, if the Latina has autonomy and power in that room, if the Latina is speaking for the people, if the Latina is standing in the gap, if the Latina is doing what the people are in need of that Latina to do at the table. But if equity is a Latina at the table who cannot speak, whose words are not valued, whose suggestions are ignored, then I am not in an equitable space. I'm in the space that just wants a Latino face. And that is structural racism at its best, because in a majority of the boards that exist, where the decisions are made, where the policies are made, where the money is rendered, those rooms are void of people who can make suggestions that look like the people who are impacted the most. So when we are talking about equity and people say, well, it's diverse, it's not diverse if it's 100% African American. It's not diverse if it's 100% Latino and we're trying to impact a diverse community. It's not diverse if we're 100% Caucasian. That is not diversity. Diversity is when we acknowledge the voices of all the people that we intend to impact, because each one has a lived experience that is different, both by their cultural identification, their sexual identification, and merely just being a human being living in this world. Next slide. Structural racism, catalyst to food deserts. Next slide. Food desert defined. I want you to take notice of the departments that I'm mentioning. The Department of Agriculture, Treasury, Health and Human Services are bringing together resources and expertise to support sustainable projects and strategies to eliminate food deserts. Private companies, local and tribal governments, and nonprofit organizations will be able to apply for federal funds from these 3 departments to implement strategies to increase access to healthy, affordable foods. Now, there are multiple nonprofits in this room, representatives of nonprofits, people who have stood in the gap for a very long time. And this date is 2011. One of the things that we can say about accessing those federal funds to implement those strategies is there are criteria that must be met by the nonprofit in order to even be eligible to receive the funding. There are gaps, there are obstacles in the amounts of fiscal responsibility that the nonprofit organization has had in their previous years in order to access the funding. So when we say organizations will be able to apply for federal fundings, yes, you can apply. Will you receive them? Only if deemed by the people reviewing the application. Next slide. ERS's food desert locator is based on a definition developed by the USDA, the Treasury, and the Health and Human Services Department. Now, I don't have the statistic for what I'm about to say, but I'm sure I can pull it within reason. The top tier leadership for the USDA, I will beg to differ if there's more than 50% diverse leadership in the USDA. The Department of Treasury, the top ranking officials are not diverse in most cases. And again, remember my definition for diversity. It does not mean whether you are a person of color. It means, are you a person of color who is going to be valued, understood, and make a difference for the people who need it the most? And this is defined by low income census tracts with a substantial number of shares of residents with low levels of access to retail outlets, selling healthy foods and affordable foods are defined as food deserts. A census tract is a small, relatively permanent subdivision of a county that usually contains between 1,000 and 8,000 people, but generally averages around 4,000 people. Next slide. It's 2022, 10 years later. And January 4th, 2022, the New Jersey Economic Development Authority released a draft list of New Jersey's 50 designated food desert communities. 10 years have passed, and in those 10 years, people were still impacted with limited to zero food access to fresh and healthy food. And even though in those years, I can attest for the work of Newark Science and Sustainability and the work of the other organizations represented here, we have been in the trenches, developing urban farms, urban gardens, bringing workshops, showing people how to grow their own food, educating children on STEM, on learning how to be engineers, learning how to build and think beyond what their circumstances were. It still was 10 years that passed. Next slide. We have an obligation as state leaders and as human beings to ensure that no New Jerseyan goes to bed hungry, regardless of their socioeconomic status. That was said by the Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver after the release of that document. Next slide. But who is we? Who is we? Next slide. Please enter your name or your organization's name in the chat. Excellent. Steam Urban, Bilal Walker, Newark Science and Sustainability, Shani Patterson, Urban Agricultural Cooperative, Lana Mustafa, Lisa, Morning Glory Garden, Mika Sinclair, Faces of Fallen Fathers, Ampere Civic Improvement Association. That's the way, ladies and gentlemen, in this chat. Next slide. I asked you in the beginning to think of a time when you were hungry as a child and describe some of the feelings you felt and behaviors you exhibited. Next slide. Food and its access is at the center of who you are today, physically, economically, emotionally, consciously, empathetically. Next slide. Food and its access is about humanity. Thank you. My name is Dr. Jacqueleen Bido. I appreciate your time. Next slide. And that's my contact information. It is an honor to be a part of Newark Science and Sustainability, Inc. I have the pleasure of working with one of the most passionate people when it comes to urban farming, urban agriculture, and making sure we spread the word about what we're doing in the city of Newark. And we collaborate with a host of amazing organizations, Emilio, Fallon, Bilal, all of you, Royston, Mancoba, all of you, we thank you, Lana. We thank you so much for your collaborations. And so I turn this over to the panel and the audience for deeper discussion. And thank you for your participation in the chat.